Folks, we're about to get started. I guess it is my pleasure to reintroduce our next guest, Dr. Samuel Goldman, who is an associate professor of political science at George Washington University, executive director of the John L. Loeb Jr. Institute for Religious Freedom, and director of the Politics and Values program. And as of course you know from last night, he is the literary editor for Modern Age. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Samuel Goldman.
Thank you, Kenan, and good morning, everyone. I confess that it was with a certain trepidation that I received the schedule giving me this slot. There's both bad fortune and good in giving the first lecture on the last day of a grueling week. And the bad fortune is that I know this is not a time likely to arouse the most avid attention. So while I do hope that you will enthusiastically join me in thinking about the relation between intellectual history and politics, I also understand that I may have to draw you along somewhat unwillingly, and that is my burden this morning. My advantage, on the other hand, is that you are already steeped in conversation about many of the figures and topics that I'm going to discuss. And in fact, Johnny Burtka's remarks yesterday prefigured some of the arguments that I'll make this morning. And that allows me to dispense with the customary warm-up and get right to the heart of the matter. So let's begin by considering the origins and implications of one of those famous phrases that has become so familiar that it tends to escape critical reflection. The phrase is "ideas have consequences," and as you probably know, it has become one of the most enduring slogans of the American conservative movement. Introduced by the title of Richard Weaver's 1948 book, the phrase "ideas have consequences" became a synecdoche for belief that the catastrophes of the 20th century, including the world wars, the rise of communism, and the Nazi Holocaust, had been permitted and even perhaps caused by corruptions in aesthetic theory, epistemology, theology, and political philosophy. According to the historian George Nash, quote, "This was the message of the proliferating critiques of liberalism in the early post-war years. Liberalism, with its cult of suspended judgment, was flabby and confused. It had too long allowed itself to be seduced, even raped, by totalitarian ideologies. In its relativistic, bend-over-backward, secular, scientistic, pragmatic way, it was undermining a civilization in which it no longer believed." Different conservative intellectuals offered their own versions of this argument. Many of the so-called individualists of the period, we would now describe them as libertarians, traced the problem to the critique of natural rights by Victorian-era intellectuals. On this view, the substitution of subjective concepts of utility for rationally accessible foundations eroded the moral confidence necessary to defend civilization against barbarism and freedom against tyranny. Weaver's diagnosis, which proved appealing to more religiously minded conservatives, was different in locating the crucial mistake at a much earlier historical moment. Weaver contended that, quote, "Western man made an evil decision, which has become the efficient cause of other evil decisions, all the way back in the 14th century. In his judgment, quote, "The defeat of logical realism in the great medieval debate was the crucial event in the history of Western culture. From this flowed those acts which now issue in modern decadence." Now, even at the time, this was a somewhat recondite argument. We often imagine that educational standards were so much higher in the past that people knew immediately what the medieval debate about logical realism meant. I don't think that was true even in the 1940s. And today, it's probably even less likely that readers know what Weaver was getting at. So I want to spend a little time tracing Weaver's reference to a recurring dispute in the history of Western philosophy about the status of universals, as they're known. That is to say, general concepts such as love, justice, or beauty. Are such concepts real? That's what a line of argument extending back to Plato maintained. On this view, universals are not just verbal expressions, not just words, but are in some mysterious way elements of being. In the following centuries, Christian theologians integrated Plato's position with an understanding of the divine as articulating necessary structures of reality. To simplify, perhaps grossly, their belief was that the properties attributed to God are not simply matters of belief. Rather, they are eternal and rationally accessible truths. Needless to say, this claim gave theological disputes a particular gravity. To be wrong about God didn't just mean making a mistake, which might be assessed in the next life. It was a fundamental error of perception. Thomas Aquinas offered a modified version of this argument, with some help from Aristotle's distinction between essence and existence. But that modification did not convince everyone. Another school of medieval theologians argued that universals are simply verbal expressions. They're words that we human beings use to make sense of relations between particular objects. Rather than possessing objective reality, then, universals can be understood as terms of convenience, that is to say, as names. Hence the description of this school of thought as nominalism. William of Ockham is the most famous representative of this view. If you have read the wonderful novel by Umberto Eco, The Name of the Rose, or perhaps seen the not-so-good movie, you may have been introduced to Ockham, whom Eco imagines as a sort of medieval Sherlock Holmes. Now, in principle, nominalism was a defense of divine omnipotence. Rather than being constrained by logical rules, the nominalists argued, God made every particular thing with absolutely unique properties. And arguably, that is a supreme show of power. This is why a couple of centuries later, Jean Calvin would adopt certain nominalist positions in his defense of the truly awesome God of the Hebrew Bible against what he considered a thin and unsatisfying rational theism. The implication of this argument, though, was that the apparently intelligible structures of reality are really a product of human cognition. The suggestion is that reality is in the eye of the beholder. And that implies further that in a certain way we can change the structure of reality by modifying the language that we use, the names that we apply to groups of things. So you can see a hint of so-called postmodernism here, all the way back in the 14th century. Weaver argued that in the long run, it was this philosophical position that generated first the relativistic utilitarianism of the 19th century. Eventually, he contended it inspired the Nietzschean philosophies of will that would dominate the 20th century. Instead of a recent and somewhat arbitrary critique of natural rights, then, the vulnerability of Western civilization for Weaver was built into the whole modern understanding of reason. And that meant that an antidote could not be accomplished by making adjustments to policies or institutions. Instead, a fundamentally different cast of mind was required. Russell Kirk recalled that Weaver wanted to call the book in which he developed this argument The Fearful Descent. And sensing that that title would not exactly thrill the book-purchasing public, the director of the University of Chicago Press insisted that it be called Ideas Have Consequences. Weaver's biographer, Joseph Scotchy, reports that Weaver hated the change, and apparently he even threatened to cancel the book's publication if his preferred title were not restored. But I think, in retrospect, it's clear that Weaver's editor had good marketing instincts. Ideas Have Consequences may not have perfectly expressed what Weaver was trying to say, but it did encapsulate an idea already in circulation, and which would grow more popular over the coming decade, that philosophical argument is the true motor of history. And that's why I think this phrase remains relatively familiar, even though Weaver himself has sunk into comparative obscurity, except, of course, at ISI. Perhaps Weaver was wise to prefer the less catchy formulation, though. The degeneration of the phrase "ideas have consequences" into a cliché reflects and may even encourage a dangerously reductive tendency in American conservative thought. Basically, it designates an assumption that merely expressing subversive ideas was enough to produce significant and even revolutionary social and political consequences. And it seems to follow that the opposite is also true, that pronouncing more salutary ideas will therefore be sufficient to put society back on the right course. The consequence of that suggestion, it seems to me, unintentional and perhaps unconscious, is often to move the action of politics into learned books and out of governing institutions. If ideas necessarily have consequences, the decisive thing is what one thinks or writes rather than what one does. And the crucial actors, both past and present, are limited to the small group of people who read and write such books. There's no obvious strategy for connecting with the much larger majority who take no interest in these matters. Now, this confidence in the efficacy of ideas is flattering to intellectuals, including me, who can then regard themselves as unacknowledged legislators of the human race. But I think, or at least I'm going to suggest this morning, that the conflation of politics with intellectual history leads to strategic errors. One of those errors is overemphasis on high-level classroom instruction and theoretical argument. These activities often come at the expense of direct organization and attention to the professional and financial incentives that shape the behavior of mostly non-ideological actors. That makes it hard to achieve the kind of counter-revolutionary results that the theory is supposed to enable. And let me give you a concrete example of what I mean. Conservatives have devoted enormous resources to cultivating college instructors, both in the nascent stages of their career and after they are launched in their professional lives. And I personally have benefited a great deal, both personally and professionally, from programs of this kind. Now, the goal here is not simply to make life easier for graduate students or junior professors. Presumably, it's to encourage a process of trickle-down from great books to ordinary minds. But the mechanism by which this occurs is more often assumed than argued. And I can report from my own experience that I can barely get students to do the reading, let alone convince them to adopt fundamentally different moral, religious, or political perspectives. Incidentally, I think that the difficulty of influencing students, which I don't think is entirely a reflection of my own limitations as a teacher, should encourage some skepticism about the threat of indoctrination in higher education. I mentioned this in my conversation with Dan McCarthy last night. Students are immersed in a comprehensive progressive milieu, but the classroom is usually the least bad part of that, and in many cases it serves as an escape from the bullying ideological and anti-intellectual confines of the student affairs and residence life world. In this case, though, a single-minded emphasis on great books can distract from a likely more effective strategy for producing broad political change. That is recruiting and mobilizing K through 12 teachers and administrators. Because they start much earlier, primary and secondary schools exercise much greater influence. And they're also exposed to many more students. Remember that only a minority of American young people go to college, let alone study Plato. Contrary to popular understanding, traditional sources and approaches, if not always conservative political arguments, are reasonably well represented at many universities. But as we have learned over the last 12 months or so, they are rapidly disappearing from primary and secondary education. The left has adopted the opposite strategy. You've probably heard lurid accounts of so-called tenured radicals indoctrinating students with Marcuse or Marx. But in fact, the most effective vehicles of left-wing influence on education have been boring bureaucratic structures, such as accrediting requirements that mandate schools to adopt tendentious diversity, equity, and inclusion standards, and then financial aid rules that allow the use of public funds only at schools accredited under these standards. These mandates create demand for specially trained administrators, consultants, and teachers who then demand more bureaucratic mandates in order to fulfill their tasks. It's all more of an institutional feedback loop than it is a coherent ideology. Certainly, there's a role for ideas here. The DEI agenda was not developed in a vacuum, and theorists and intellectuals played a role in articulating and promulgating it among future teachers and civil servants. But this wasn't only a matter of intellectual persuasion. What we call wokeness is in many ways a legally required consequence of civil rights statutes that require elaborate statistical comparison of various groups of citizens. These laws generate evidence of disparities of outcome, and that evidence becomes itself the justification for intervention, again encouraging the bureaucratic feedback loop that I described. So in addition to tracing the influence of ideas all the way back to the 19th century or even earlier, we need to understand the influence of institutional structures. And incidentally, in giving this account of the bureaucratic sources of wokeness, I'm drawing on the scholar James C. Scott's important book, Seeing Like a State. That's just education. One might tell a similar story about federal agencies, the foundation and nonprofit complex, and other major institutions. Focusing on the ostensibly inevitable consequences of ideas, conservatives have paid relatively little attention to the structural and regulatory factors that drive such institutions toward the left, sometimes contrary to their stated missions, and often despite changes of leadership at the top. We're paying the price for that neglect now. Now, once again, I am not saying that ideas don't matter. Arguments by philosophers can influence the course of human events. Marx himself is an example, even though his materialist philosophy sometimes suggests otherwise. His ideas really did seem to change the world, and that was an important part of the historical background for Weaver's argument. But ideas are not the only thing that matter. Interests, structures, and sometimes sheer contingency do too. Moreover, we shouldn't assume that ideas first enter the world when they are expressed in great books. To the contrary, philosophers are often articulating claims, concepts, or arguments that are already latent in practice, rather than engaging, like the biblical God, in creation de novo. Weaver was aware of the limitations of his own claim, and he explicitly acknowledges that ideas have consequences, or the argument he presents in Ideas Have Consequences, could be criticized for deriving vast and complicated effects from a single, and as I briefly described, rather abstract cause. But he thought that the criticism was worth accepting in order to defend human freedom against deterministic philosophies of history. It was with such philosophies in mind that Weaver insisted, quote, that the conscious policies of men and governments are not mere rationalizations of what has been brought about by unaccountable forces. They are rather deductions from our most basic ideas of human destiny, and they have great, though not unobstructed, power to determine our course. Note the qualifications that Weaver packs into these sentences. He asserts that conscious policies are not mere rationalizations of unperceived influences, and that conceptions of human destiny have large but not unobstructed power. He does not claim that unaccountable forces have no influence on politics, or that basic ideas are the source of all human actions. In Ideas Have Consequences, what Weaver aimed to show is that we are not subjects of an historical process over which we exercise no influence. The unforgettable title, however, implies a pessimistic inversion of the linear, unitary, and ultimately freedom-denying ways of thinking that Weaver set out to oppose. In the years that followed the publication of Ideas Have Consequences, the political philosopher Leo Strauss developed another influential account of the decline of the West. Weaver presented the nominalist critique of universals as the original sin of modernity. For Strauss, the fatal turn occurred about 2 centuries later, with Machiavelli's encouragement to pursue the effectual truth rather than the Greek ideal of theoretical wisdom. Strauss elaborated this argument in his essay, 3 Waves of Modernity. From Locke and Hobbes' case for the rational control of nature, to Rousseau and Marx's arguments for the rational control of man, to Nietzsche's attack on reason itself, it appeared that the intellectual history of the past 4 centuries has been one immense slippery slope. And hinted, but not really explicitly argued in Strauss's account, was the claim that actual political history, the development of governments and institutions, followed these philosophical changes in tandem. Eric Voegelin, with whom Weaver studied at Louisiana State University, offered yet another version of this argument. And he contended that the problem emerged more than a millennium before medieval nominalism. The culprit in this account is so-called Gnostic attempts to transform the world based on special knowledge available only to an elite few. Now, for Voegelin, Gnosticism was more of a recurring temptation than it was an historically specific event. But even so, he blamed many of the problems of modernity on the tendency to immanentize the eschaton, that's one of his famous phrases, that entered Western political thought with the French Revolution. And I mention that phrase because along with Ideas Have Consequences, immanentize the eschaton became something of a slogan in the early conservative movement. It even appeared on buttons worn by Young Americans for Freedom members in the 1960s, or rather, they said, "Don't immanentize the eschaton." And I want to emphasize that this tendency to explain 20th century conditions as the result of long ago philosophical developments was not limited to the right either. It was a widespread tendency in the political and social theory of the period. On the left, the so-called Frankfurt School, associated with Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, articulated a so-called Dialectic of Enlightenment, in which the search for rational understanding of physical reality ends up reducing all reality, including the human person, to mere matter for exploitation. And Adorno and Horkheimer gave different versions of this argument in different texts, but they sometimes extended it all the way back to Odysseus, whom they presented as the first modern man. As this very brief survey indicates, Weaver, Strauss, Voegelin, and Adorno differed on many issues, including the role of religion, particularly Christianity, in this history. But all offered readers a broadly similar message, which is that the horrors of modern life were inevitable consequences of bad ideas introduced long ago. Now, in this talk, I'm speaking as a critic of historical reductionism, so I don't want to be reductive in my interpretations of these important works. read carefully and with due attention to the milieus in which they appeared, books like Ideas Have Consequences, Natural Right and History, The New Science of Politics, and The Dialectic of Enlightenment do not substitute intellectual determinism for the economic determinism of the Marxists whom they opposed. Nevertheless, the sweeping rhetoric and extraordinary learning that these works display sometimes makes it difficult for the caveats and qualifications to be perceived. Combined with what Vogelin diagnosed, I think accurately, as the perennial appeal of secret histories that place readers among a small elite who perceive the true sources of otherwise bewildering events, they helped propagate a version of the very distortion that they were written to oppose. The temptation to combat theories of progress with deterministic theories of decline survives even in more recent conservative polemics. Some of the specific critiques they present are well-founded, but so-called post-liberals sometimes sound as if they believe that the existence of Justice Anthony Kennedy was logically required by the essence of Francis Bacon. According to Patrick Deneen, the dysfunction of our present institutions and the corruption of civic and family life are, quote, are the result of, quote, a political philosophy conceived some 500 years ago and put into effect at the birth of the United States nearly 250 years later. And you should note here the telescoping of centuries of history down to a single process. Centuries that included vast disagreements, struggles, and altogether unpredictable turns of fortune. Everything seems to follow neatly, like logical conclusions from a premise. What I want to suggest this morning, though, is that history just doesn't work that way. As I argued in a review of Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed, his account also gives too much importance to ideas altogether. A constitutional government, let alone a whole society, is more than a plaything of its philosophers. And indeed, the intellectual influences on the American founding were much more expansive than Deneen admits. In addition to, and in many ways more importantly than proto-liberal rationalism, they included English common law, neo-Roman republicanism, and Protestant theology. The geographic, economic, and historical conditions of early America were also important for understanding the course of the American founding. Dispersed settlement through wilderness far from the reach of the period's technology almost certainly encouraged quasi-liberal assumptions about personal freedom and the voluntary basis of authority. No political philosophy, whether Locke's or another writer's, was needed. Sensitive observers of American and modern life have always recognized the limitations of philosophical influence on politics. And as an example, we might mention only one of Deneen's own sources, Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville explicitly denied that Americans were subject to the influence of formal philosophy. The reason, he argued, was quite simple. They hadn't read a word of it. Most Americans had not even heard the names of the great philosophers of modernity, let alone those of the ancient world. At the same time, Tocqueville contended, the conditions of American life encouraged habits of thought that were similar to certain philosophical positions, even though they had a very different cause. And in Democracy in America, he characterizes these habits as Cartesianism, by which he means skepticism of authority, reliance on sensory evidence, and a tendency to generalize beyond one's actual experience. Americans were not Cartesians for Tocqueville because ideas have consequences. They were Cartesians because they lived in a place, time, and society that encouraged a certain cast of mind. This, according to Tocqueville, is the real reason that democracy took hold contrary to the intentions of the framers, that is to say, contrary to the efforts of those who actually were philosophically informed. In his accounting, the constitutional framing and the period of federalist rule that followed it were a sort of fortuitous episode that provided political breathing room for the development of institutions that could restrain the underlying democratic currents. Those currents, again, were not produced by the ideas of Descartes, Locke, or anyone else. They were responses to the conditions of the place and the period. The political theorist Louis Hartz took a similar view. And Hartz is maligned, particularly by conservatives, for suggesting that Lockean liberalism is the core of the American political tradition. And as a claim about direct intellectual influence, as I've already suggested, that's really just not true. Locke and related thinkers were at best one of several influences on the American founding, and historical evidence suggests that they were far from the most influential on the whole, despite the iconic status of Jefferson. But that's not really what Hartz said. Rather, he contended, like Tocqueville, that it was the conditions of American life that inclined many Americans to practical conclusions that resembled Locke's arguments, even if, and maybe because, they were totally unfamiliar with his writings. In much of this country, until a very late date, the kinds of settled influences, settled institutions and enduring influences that conservatives tend to prize simply did not exist. The state of nature was never a literal reality, but it was not a terrible approximation of the truth about much of North America well into the 19th century. That's far from our condition today, though. And the decline of what is sometimes called classical liberalism seems to me less a consequence of changes in college syllabuses than of changing material conditions. There is no more free land, which once provided an opportunity for exit from oppressive arrangements and also for the formation of new communities. The ownership of capital is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a transnational oligarchy. New technologies vastly increase the possibilities of surveillance and behavioral influence, even without the appearance of direct coercion. And finally, the development of the fiat currency and the status of the dollar as an international reserve seemingly enables us to borrow indefinitely without repaying, removing what were once considered natural limits on the size and activity of government. So what can we do under these changed circumstances? Well, I think Vogelin might have reminded us that the aspiration to control human events is a Gnostic delusion. We are not masters of our fate, and we become monsters when we try to achieve the domination that God or nature have denied to us. But at the same time, I don't want to lapse into resignation. We do not choose the circumstances under which we make history, but on those conditions, we do face choices. So I'm going to conclude with just three, not like Johnny Burka's 17, but just three suggestions for moving beyond intellectual history and toward political strategy. First, I think it's important to resist what I would describe as the fallacy of origins, or sometimes it's called a genetic fallacy. And I mean the claim that understanding the beginnings of some phenomenon that the beginnings of some phenomenon are the most important factor for understanding its meaning today. And one version of this fallacy includes arguments that because the American Republic was flawed in one way or another in the past, its results today are subject to the same taint. I think that fallacy is found mostly on the left. The 1619 Project is just the most dramatic example. But as Deneen's argument shows, there are also versions on the right. Even if you think that the United States was badly founded in certain respects, that is not per se an argument against its condition today. Things change for good and ill. The late Peter Lawler liked to say things are always getting better and worse, and I think that's a maxim worth keeping in mind. And both moral and political analysis need to consider the reality of change rather than pursuing moments of absolute definition in the past. Second, it's essential to revive the distinction between theory and practice. Arguments about who said what, when, often tell us very little about the function or non-function of specific institutions in particular places, past or present. So too, ceremonial pronouncements by statesmen need to be balanced against their pursuit of specific purposes rather than treated as philosophical arguments derived from other philosophical arguments. And I think the study of the founders and the other saints of American civil religion would benefit particularly from this distinction. We might also spend less time arguing about the proper meaning of terms and more time talking about the activities they designate. We need definitions in order to speak intelligibly, but it's usually better to derive those from current usage or at least historical inquiry, rather than appealing to some theoretical essence. Whatever may be the case in metaphysics, in matters of politics, the nominalists were right. We give names to unique phenomena of our own volition and for our own purposes, not because we have grasped some eternal truth. Pursuing this reorientation doesn't mean rejecting books or ideas, but I think it does encourage us to consider seeking some additional teachers. And in particular, I would encourage the reading of the tradition of political sociology that emerged in the 19th century. Tocqueville, of course, is a great representative of this tradition and is familiar, but figures like Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, who are far less often read, are also giants of that moment. As Robert Nisbet tirelessly argued, this style of thinking is in many ways congruent with conservative presuppositions about the complex unintended nature of social relations, the deficiencies of rational argument, and the relational quality of human existence. But it continues to be mostly ignored in favor of a relatively narrow canon of political philosophy concerned with the ultimate ends of mankind. Third and finally, we should emphasize practical means to practical ends. Intellectual persuasion is difficult, and as evidence suggests, not very effective. If you want people to do some things and to avoid others, then it's important to understand and sometimes alter the structures of material incentives that they face. Normal people do not have firm ideological convictions one way or the other, and usually aren't interested in acquiring them. But they do like to be paid, promoted, or otherwise rewarded. Libertarians have been blamed, I think somewhat unfairly, for the challenges that confront right-of-center elements in American life. But libertarian scholars, particularly those associated with the so-called public choice school, have actually been among the most insightful analysts of the structural conditions that encourage progressive and statist outcomes. If we want to change the outcomes, we need to change those conditions. To return to education, and again, to make this more concrete, and I mention education because it's a recurring theme of these debates, I think that a measure to eliminate education schools' role in credentialing teachers would probably do more good than any changes mandated to the formal curriculum. Now, my intention in these remarks has not been to dismiss the teachings of Weaver, Strauss, Vogelin, or their illustrious counterparts. Writing at a moment in thrall to economic determinism, they revived the spirit of intellectual freedom and the conviction that what we think and say matters, and that was a great service. Nor were they deficient scholars. On the contrary, their provocative and at the time controversial analyses of texts and thinkers remain sources of insight, while the academic conventional wisdom of their time has been almost entirely forgotten. What they were not, though, is historians or strategists of political and social movements. In particular, they tended to lack a plausible theory of change that could explain how the corruption they perceived moved from the pages of great books into reality, or how to move from corruption to healthier conditions. And that's one of the reasons I think that practical efforts grounded in these grand narratives of intellectual history have not been particularly successful. Faced with different challenges in a different century, we need different tools for understanding how to pursue our goals. Above all, the defeat of what I think we can call, without too much controversy, therapeutic progressivism. I admit that there is a risk of self-contradiction here, because I have made a theoretical case against theory and an intellectual historical argument against intellectual history. But I want to conclude by echoing Johnny's encouragement yesterday for you to do as I say and not as I do. Ideas do have consequences, but so do you. And I think that it is in your efforts that we are more likely to find prospects for success than in the endless analysis of old books. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I really enjoyed it. So a lot of conservatives locate a lot of modern progressive ideology, and especially the aggressive form it takes in schools or in the workplace, in the ideas of so-called cultural Marxism. but they often don't really give an accounting of how cultural Marxism actually became ascendant in the universities. They just assume it's true. So do you have any ideas about like why and how it became a powerful idea, or it has such the influence where like Eric Vogelin and Strauss haven't, even if they both developed very influential ideologies among their disciples and things like that?
Well, I'm pretty skeptical of the argument that cultural Marxism or some other coherent ideological influence is really the problem here. Clearly, there has been the development of academic, of sort of schools of activist scholarship that have promoted some of these developments. But I think that's really, in many ways, more effect than cause. As I suggested very, very briefly in the lecture, a lot of the developments that people call wokeness, or for which they use other terms, are pretty clearly unanticipated consequences of well-intentioned civil rights laws, rather than the result of infiltration by cultural Marxists and others. So I see that diagnosis as one version of the problem that I'm describing, looking for intellectual historical lines of descent extending back to Marx or Hegel or some other villain, rather than considering the logic of institutions and regulatory structures that were often set up for quite different purposes, but have these unintended and sometimes unanticipated consequences. So too, I mentioned in the talk the role of education schools, and if you are looking for an institutional location where these ideas really are most powerful, education schools are probably the best example you can find. But I think the problem with education schools is less that they exist than that they have been granted heavy influence and sometimes a near monopoly on training and accrediting teachers. So rather than worrying about the influence of Mao, Marx, and Marcuse, I would just look at accrediting standards, or I would do that first. So those are some of the reasons I think that left-wing tendencies have been magnified by important institutions, whereas conservative responses have tended to operate exclusively on the level of ideas, which is useful. I'm not dismissing that, but has to be embedded into structures and institutions that channel behavior, rather than functioning primarily at the level of learned argument and classroom instruction.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. So I see that you're criticizing the purely academic institutions. Perhaps ISI would count as one, where it's educational and you discuss old thinkers who wrote the conservative route half a century ago and stuff like that. But I'm wondering, would you also criticize policy institutes? Because conservatives have plenty of those, it seems like, that try to promote policies and instruct politicians on what would make the world a better place based on conservative ideas. So you could argue that that's where the rubber meets the road. And I'm wondering what your opinion, for example, would be on Turning Point USA, which seems to be more of an activist institution, but also is a bit too crude, probably for most people's taste here.
So I don't know enough about what exactly Turning Point USA does. You know, I just see the YouTube clips where they're shooting money out of air cannons, and I admit that doesn't appeal to me very much. But I'm not sufficiently informed to give any specific judgment. I'm not really criticizing what ISI does at all. I think this is important work, and I wouldn't be here if I didn't agree. I do think that we tend to emphasize political philosophy at the expense even of other academic disciplines and approaches. So there is a gap, I think, between the very practical activist or policy world and this very abstract and high-level argument about ultimate human ends and the course of history. And I think some of that gap could be filled in simply by renewed interest in other academic disciplines and approaches. And one of the things that I really like about this particular week is the attention that it's paid to history. There are very, very few conservative practicing historians. I think there should be more. I think the same is true of sociology and other social sciences. So I'm not arguing against theoretical education or the academic enterprise, but I am suggesting that it could be expanded a little bit. And retrospectively, that the concentration of intellectual conservative efforts in political philosophy, although there were understandable reasons for that 50 and more years ago, was also counterproductive in certain ways.
But are there any institutions that are enacting, like trying to get high school teachers to be more conservative, or trying to get administrators at universities or admissions officers like systematically to be more conservative?
Not that I know of. Which doesn't mean they don't exist. But the other week, I published a column in which I suggested the idea of a federalist society for teachers and administrators. I think something like that would be extremely useful and does not require the restoration of a fundamentally different perception on reality.
Thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. It seems that conservatives have a disproportionate number of people in academia, and we're wondering if you think that this high saturation is part of the problem that you described.
I mean, again, there's a risk of self-contradiction here, because of course this is what I do, or this is what I do in one of my jobs. But yeah, I mean, I think one concern is concentration in academia. Another, as I was just describing, is the concentration in particular corners of academia. And for complicated reasons that we can get into in the break or at another time, political theory was the path of least resistance for conservatives, and that led to the establishment of the strongest conservative or right-of-center infrastructure in that field, and that was a good thing to do. But as is often the case, these strategies have unintended consequences, and I think that now, and for some time, conservatives have been overinvested in political theory at the expense of other areas of study.
Thank you.
Hi, so our question is, at what point should we move from philosophical contemplation to practical means if we want to achieve practical ends?
Right. Well, you have to, first of all, that's a question for you, not for me. I mean, you really have to think about what it is that you want to accomplish, and that's not a question that I can answer for you, and there are people who are called to a contemplative life, and that's a wonderful and important thing, but probably not everybody. So you have to consult your own hopes, inclinations, and also abilities. And one of the things that I would add to Johnny's remarks from yesterday, just as a piece of very practical advice, is to think hard about what you're good at. And where your comparative advantage lies. And sometimes you will find that in activities that you enjoy most and to which you are most attracted. Sometimes you won't. But figuring out what you can do better than other people, and doing that is often a more effective strategy for winning some influence than following a path that someone else has prescribed to you.
Awesome, thank you.
So we were wondering, because you talked a lot about the influence of K through 12 schooling, and I think how it's really underestimated these days. I was wondering, just kind of on a more practical note, do you recommend that if you want to change K through 12 schooling, is it better to go into teaching or maybe serve on a school board and try and influence it that way? Or do you think it's almost a losing battle with how strong the infrastructure is, and is it better to maybe pursue something like homeschooling your children or trying to start a very small school yourself?
Mm-hmm. Well, it depends partly where you live, and the opportunities for alternative education in some places are more favorable than elsewhere. It also depends whether you are talking about your professional career or about meeting the needs of your own children or community, and those might produce different answers. But my suspicion is that there will always be people who are going to run for school board, and the influence of school boards is actually pretty limited. So going into the profession and being willing to devote 10 or 20 or 30 years to the activity is probably more likely to make the kind of impact that you have in mind. And I think focusing on education politics in particular, one of the reasons that these successive waves of conservative revolt that really extend back at least to the 1970s, and in some ways much earlier, keep failing, is that they tend to focus on political oversight, whether at the school board level or the state legislature, rather than actually joining and participating in these institutions. And that's why, as I said, I think changes to things like teacher accreditation, which are totally boring, these are totally boring regulatory issues that nobody knows about, is more important than designing a new curriculum that will orient students to the true, the good, and the beautiful. With good teachers, it doesn't matter so much what the curriculum says or what the textbook is, and with bad teachers, the same thing is true. So if that's something that appeals to you, and it would have to, because it's not an easy career in many ways, that seems more likely to be an effective course than running for your local school board. But if you're inclined in that way, that's a good thing to do too.
Thank you.
This topic has been touched on a bit by other questions, but I'm going to try and maybe boil it down to one. This week has not been one of political activism or mobilization. So if hope for the effectuation of change lies in actions rather than in the endless analysis of books, kind of what are we doing here? Like, how do we
Right.
make sure we're not blinded by the light of the sun and that we do, in fact, return to the cave at some point?
Well, first of all, this is 1 week out of 52, and I suspect and know in some cases that you don't get this kind of thing in the other 51 weeks in the year, which makes it all the more important to do it when you do have the opportunity. And again, I'm not arguing against the study of old books and great ideas, quite the contrary. What I do think would be useful, and this event may not be the correct setting for it, but I can imagine other events that might be useful, is figuring out how some of these institutional structures work and how to work within them, which is not exactly practical activism training. How to get a bill passed. That's not what I'm talking about. But thinking about the operation of institutions and the possibility for influencing those institutions in light of some of these broader philosophical arguments. Those things don't seem to me to be mutually exclusive. On the contrary, I think they reinforce each other.
Thank you, sir.
Hi. So education administration and policy and politics is exactly the type of thing that I want to go into. And so you keep on bringing up that as one of the examples of, okay, there's a bureaucratic system, there's an administrative system here, and we ought to, put some of our focus on it. And you keep on mentioning teacher credentials. So I was just wondering, what is your specific prescription? Like, what is your specific recommendation for changing that? Because it changes from state to state, and so I just want an example of how do we effectuate change in those conditions.
Yeah. So here, as I mentioned, is a theoretically simple, maybe politically difficult, but theoretically simple change. Make it easy for people who have degrees in substantive disciplines to be certified as teachers, rather than requiring them to pursue education degrees. And the reason for that, as I mentioned in my talk and also a little bit last night, is that substantive departments, although far from perfect, are really not so bad. Ed schools are a nightmare. So that's a very sort of simple substantive change that would make it a lot easier for people like you to enter the teaching profession and engage in some of those activities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. You stated that the course of human events is often more closely influenced by material conditions than intellectual ideas. Do you think that the conditions that allowed progressivism to flourish and gain adherence will change, or has already changed, or could change to encourage conservative ideas in the future?
That's a really good question. I think there are some suggestions that may be the case. I mean, one of the recurring tendencies, and probably you discussed this when you were looking at Hayek in your reading groups, of bureaucratic institutions is to accept responsibilities that they can't discharge. I think Richard Reinsch was also talking about this yesterday, and that creates a crisis of confidence because they claim that they can do certain things, and then it becomes clear that they can't actually deliver the goods that they promise. So in certain ways, I think the really dramatic failure of bureaucratic institutions over the last year in responding to the pandemic is an opportunity Because the problem, as it seems to me, is not that they're dummies at the FDA or CDC. It's that institutions that are set up this way and given such an expansive set of tasks can never deliver the things that we want from them. So that could be a sort of springboard for a broader critique. That's not exactly material. We're not talking about strictly economic conditions in the Marxist sense, but it's very much in the realm of interaction between institutions and ideas and incentives and practical results that I'm trying to emphasize. And one of the advantages of this kind of argument is that you can use these examples to persuade people without appealing to their visions of the ultimate purposes of the human race. Competence is not exactly non-ideological, but it does cast a broader net than debates about the nature of man and so on.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the lecture. I found it very interesting. I'm just curious, because I don't think you mentioned this in the lecture. What do you believe is the role of media, entertainment, and social media on the intellectual climate or the cultural climate of the day? Because I know from personal experience, like my school, everybody's on Instagram, and over the course of like the past year, I've been seeing like a lot of this, the academic jargon, and a lot of like what you would call, wokeism, critical race theory, that stems from like elite academia, but it's diluted into like a form of civic activism, and I see it very predominant and very like pervasive on media climate and what people consider to be acceptable on these issues. So as that relates to like the history of ideas, it does have something to do with institutional, like the nuances of that, but I also feel like that's almost enables certain ideas flowing from academics, kind of that like a lot of conservatives critique. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think as somebody else was arguing over the last few days, maybe it was Bill McClay, that when we're dealing with stories and narratives, you need to provide alternate stories and narratives. And academic argument, one way or another, is not really the most powerful influence. So I think another area in which the conservative movement has really been deficient is generating and sustaining an alternative culture that really appeals to people and that can compete with some of these other influences which, in my view, which may not be correct, are operating much more on the level of emotional affinity and intuition than they actually are concerned with the specific academic arguments. And in some ways, the debate over so-called critical race theory is a good example, because it's not really critical race theory as it's taught in universities. That argument is true, but it also doesn't really matter. What it is a story about the American past and American reality, and pointing out the theoretical deficiencies in that story, real as they are, is not really to the point. There has to be an alternative story, and one that's conveyed not only by formal instruction, and here I disagree with some people who think the formal curriculum is the most important thing, but at the level of story and narrative, and that means through film, music, literature, culture, and all of these things that young people like you pay much more attention to
Right.
than what someone is droning on about at the front of the class.
So follow-up question, what are some concrete things you believe that we can do as conservatives on our campuses to provide that type of counter-narrative that is convincing, persuasive, and also I guess demonstrates that like a stronger sense of community than what identity politics offers?
I think the trick, or at least what I have observed on my campus, is finding activities or subjects that are not obviously ideologically freighted and that don't require comprehensive buy-in. So if there are films or books or musical interests that you think reflect and encourage not just conservative policies, which is sort of not interesting, but the proper direction of human life, those are often better ways to attract people and influence them rather than more limited political activities.
Okay, thank you.
You mentioned that people like to be paid, promoted, and rewarded, and I was thinking, that got me thinking about kind of industrial policy, economic policy, some of the kind of rise on the right of nationalist economics, populist economics, whatever you want to call it. So I was wondering your thoughts on some of that rise on the right, and whether that's a very practical message to give to people that would be effective at winning them over. So, like, I mean, Michael Lind calls it national developmentalism, kind of the reindustrialization and reinvigorating the manufacturing sector,
Right.
or paid family leave through various mechanisms proposed by, like, Mike Lee of Utah and Marco Rubio. So recognizing that those ideas, those policies also have consequences,
Right.
But instead of moving away from, I think it's probably an unfair critique to call it market fundamentalism, but moving away from this intellectual tradition that we have from Adam Smith to Thomas Sowell, and moving more towards that as a practical message to win voters, trying to execute that, and then deal with some of the problems that it's going to cause after the fact.
In principle, I think that's right, and is consistent, as you perceive, with what I'm suggesting here. I myself am skeptical about the ability to deliver some of these goods, and that gets to my skepticism about the CDC and FDA. It's hard for me to understand how, looking at that experience, you could conclude that we need more centralized economic planning. Not because, it's the end of freedom and we're all going to end up serfs and so on in this sort of stylized intellectual history. I'm very, very skeptical that can actually work. So in those cases, for me, the question has a lot to do with competence and what scholars sometimes call state capacity, more than these broad arguments about the proper scope of government, natural rights to property, and the rest.
Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Goldman.
Thank you.
If everyone can